My name is Arthur, I'm 52 years old, and 6 months ago my wife and my mother-in-law were toasting with expensive wine, celebrating that they had finally left me out on the street. They looked me straight in the eyes and told me I had nothing left, that every cent I had sweated for over 2 decades belonged to them by right. They laughed in my face as they placed the divorce papers on the table, threatening to destroy me if I didn't sign and hand over the house keys that very night. They thought I was still the same weak, predictable man I had always been, the one who kept his head down just to keep peace at home. What they didn't know, what they couldn't even begin to imagine while mocking my silence, was that I had already seen everything coming. While they were planning how to spend my fortune, I had already moved the pieces so that, by the end of it all, the only thing they would inherit was an unbearable debt and a reality that would force them to beg. They wanted a dirty war, and I gave them a surgical execution. If you enjoy stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, make sure to like and subscribe. Here, we share real stories of revenge and lessons you never forget. For 22 years, I was the architect of a perfect life that others took it upon themselves to live in. I married Evelyn when we had nothing but ambition, or at least that's what I believed. At 52, I had built a solid fortune, a logistics company that operated with the precision of a Swiss watch, and a home that looked like it came straight out of an architecture magazine. My mistake wasn't working hard. My mistake was believing that gratitude was a form of currency in my marriage. Evelyn hadn't worked a single day outside the house after our daughter was born, who is now an independent adult. I never had a problem with that. I was proud to be the provider, proud that they lacked nothing. But over time, money stopped being a tool for well-being and became a divine right for her, and especially for her mother, my mother-in-law, Margaret. Margaret had always been a woman of refined gestures and a serpent's tongue. She moved into our guest house 10 years ago, supposedly for a few months, and she never left. From that position, she began planting a dangerous idea in Evelyn's mind, that my success wasn't mine, but the family's. To them, I was nothing more than a walking, breathing ATM. If I bought a new car, Margaret would ask why it wasn't a more expensive one, so she could show it off when they went out together. If I invested in land, Evelyn would complain that the money should be in an account under her name for her security. The atmosphere in my own home became dense, heavy. I would come back from 12-hour workdays and find them sitting on the terrace, drinking premium coffee and criticizing my financial decisions. There was no, "Hello, how was your day?" Only, "Why hasn't this month's transfer gone through yet?" I became a stranger at my own table. I would hear them whispering, planning trips, renovations, and luxury purchases as if money grew out of the walls. I stayed silent. I've always been a man of few words, observant. I noticed how Evelyn pulled away physically, how her eyes no longer saw me as a partner, but as an obstacle between her and the life of a single millionaire her mother kept promising her. Margaret was the mind behind the poison. She told her I was a boring man, that I was getting old, and that she deserved to enjoy life while she was still young. What hurt the most wasn't the lack of affection. It was the absolute disregard for the effort I put into every single dollar. To them, my money was something that simply appeared out of thin air. They didn't see the sleepless nights, the ulcers from the company's stress, or the risks I took. I started noticing that Evelyn was hiding bills, withdrawing cash from our joint accounts systematically. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, began treating me like a maintenance employee. She would ask me to fix things or buy her whims with an arrogance that turned my stomach. I kept pretending I didn't notice. I watched them from the doorway, seeing them browse jewelry catalogs while I ate dinner alone in the kitchen. The balance was hanging by a very thin thread. I was the pillar holding up their fantasy world, and in their infinite arrogance, they believed they could remove the pillar and the roof would keep floating above their heads. That lifestyle I gave them, that absolute comfort, was what ultimately corrupted them completely. They thought I was harmless because I was quiet. They thought my patience was stupidity, But in business, you learn that the one who speaks the least is the one who holds the most information, and I already had enough. I knew they were making moves, that Evelyn had been meeting with a divorce lawyer recommended by her mother, and that they were convinced that in court they would walk away with the mansion, the company, and half of my liquid investments. Margaret even said one afternoon, thinking I wasn't home, that as soon as we get rid of Arthur, this place will finally become a real palace. In that moment, as I listened to them laughing from the dark hallway, something inside my chest turned cold for good. I didn't feel hatred, I felt absolute clarity. The woman I shared my bed with, and the woman she brought into my home, were ready to devour me. So I decided that if they wanted to play sharks, I would show them what an empty ocean really looks like. The downfall began on a Tuesday afternoon. I arrived home earlier than usual, not because I wanted to surprise them, but because my lawyer had already handed me the reports on the bank transactions Evelyn had been trying to hide. I walked in quietly. The voices in the main living room were clear, sharp, completely devoid of any trace of affection. Evelyn was sitting on the Italian leather sofa I paid for, a glass of wine in her hand, while her mother, Margaret, paced back and forth with a folder under her arm. "Everything is ready, Evelyn," Margaret said in that shrill voice that always tried to sound refined. "The lawyer says that with the years you've been married and the lifestyle he got you used to, the settlement will be astronomical, and the house is yours. Let him move into some bachelor apartment. He's worked enough for us." Evelyn let out a dry laugh, one I had never heard in 20 years. It wasn't my wife's laugh. It was the laugh of a partner who had just scammed someone. "The best part is that Arthur has no idea," Evelyn replied. "He keeps coming home with that tired face, thinking I still put up with him out of love. It disgusts me when he touches me, Mom. I'm just waiting for the moment to throw the papers at him and watch his face fall apart when he realizes half the company is legally mine now." I stayed in the shadows of the hallway, leaning against the cold wall. My heart wasn't racing. On the contrary, it felt heavy and slow. It hurt, yes, but it was a dull pain, a disappointment turning into stone. I had spent 2 decades building an empire to give them security, and they saw it as war loot. Finally, I stepped forward and walked into the room. The silence was immediate. Evelyn set her glass down on the crystal table, and Margaret clutched the folder to her chest as if it were treasure. There was no greeting, no pretending. Evelyn stood up, adjusted her hair, and looked at me with a coldness that pierced through my bones. "Good thing you're here, Arthur," she said without a trace of guilt in her voice. "Saves us the trouble of waiting. Here." She handed me a cream-colored envelope. Divorce papers. Margaret stepped forward, positioning herself beside her daughter like a moral bodyguard. "You're no longer welcome here, Arthur," my mother-in-law declared with a triumphant smile. "We want you to pack a bag and leave tonight. The lawsuit includes a temporary restraining order for emotional distress. Don't even try to fight for the house or the savings accounts. All of that belongs to my daughter for the time she wasted by your side." I looked at the document. I didn't read it. I already knew what it said. I raised my eyes to Evelyn. I searched for any trace of the woman I had shared my life with, but all I found was greed. "Is this what you want?" I asked in a whisper, my voice as calm as I could fake. "I want what I deserve," she replied, "and I want you to stop being a burden in my social life. I like your money, Arthur, but you're just boring. Sign the receipt and leave. The lawyer will handle the rest tomorrow." Margaret stepped in, moving too close to my face. I could smell her expensive perfume, the same one I gave her every Christmas. "Don't play the victim. You should be grateful we're not taking the clothes off your back. Tomorrow we're changing the locks. Your belongings will be in trash bags at the company entrance. Now leave. We have plans to discuss, and we don't want you ruining our night with your depressing presence." That was the moment I realized the magnitude of the injustice. They didn't just want to separate. They wanted to humiliate me, erase me from the very existence I had funded. Evelyn snatched the house key from my hand, a violent gesture that nearly scratched my palm. They pointed at the door as if I were an intruder, a stranger who had just broken in. I walked out with a single small suitcase under the rain, hearing the security lock click behind me. Margaret shouted something from the window about starting over with class, and I heard their laughter echo through the empty street. They had thrown me out of my own home, out of my own story. They left me on the sidewalk with soaked clothes and the feeling that 22 years of my life had been a lie orchestrated by two parasites. But as I walked toward my car, I wasn't thinking about where I would sleep. I was thinking about the fine print in the contracts they never bothered to read. They had underestimated me, and that would be the most expensive mistake of their lives. I checked into a small hotel, far from the luxury they were used to, and sat down in front of my computer. I didn't feel anger. I felt a mathematical coldness. Evelyn and Margaret believed the fortune was a static pile of gold they just had to divide, but they didn't understand how the machinery behind my businesses actually worked. That very night, I called Marcus, my trusted lawyer and a ruthless strategist who knew every corner of my corporate structures. "Arthur, it finally happened," Marcus said on the other end of the line. "Are you ready to execute the contingency plan?" "Do it," I replied in a dry voice. "Don't leave a single loose end. I want them to feel the void beneath their feet before they even realize the ground is gone." Over the next 3 months I became a ghost. They thought I was defeated, hiding somewhere, crying over my loss, but I was rebuilding my reality in the shadows. The first step was the company. What Evelyn didn't know, because she never bothered to read the documents she signed years ago at a notary, was that the logistics company wasn't a direct personal asset. It belonged to a foreign holding entity, of which I was the sole administrator, but not the nominal owner. With Marcus's help, we began a technical liquidation process of the local assets. I started redirecting contracts from my most important clients to a new firm I had legally registered under a different name months earlier. While Evelyn was sending emails through her lawyers demanding audits of the original company, I was emptying the contents of that hollow shell. Every truck, every route, every strategic contact was quietly transferred to my new structure. But the real master move was the mansion. That house they loved so much, the one they had thrown me out of with such arrogance. Margaret was already planning to redecorate it with imported marble, using the additional credit cards I hadn't yet cancelled. However, what neither of them suspected was that the property carried a massive mortgage I had taken out a year earlier for a supposed business expansion that never happened. The money from that mortgage was safely stored in an account they would never find. Every morning, I received reports from Marcus about their movements. They were living like queens with the remaining cash in the joint accounts, spending thousands of dollars on clothes, dinners, and jewelry, convinced the flow of money would never stop. I watched the expense notifications on my phone with a bitter smile. Every dollar they spent was another nail in their own financial coffin. "They're taking the bait, Arthur," Marcus told me during one of our meetings at his office. "Evelyn just rejected the mediation offer. Her lawyer is asking for 70% of the company's valuation based on numbers from 2 years ago. They have no idea that the current valuation of that company is close to zero because of the debts we've legally assigned to that entity." "Let them keep dreaming," I said, adjusting my tie. "I want them to walk into that divorce hearing thinking they've already won. I want Margaret to buy that designer dress she saw in the magazine. I want them to celebrate ahead of time." My patience was absolute. I moved into a modest office and kept working with the same discipline I had when I started in my 20s. But now, every decision had a punitive purpose. I introduced a joint liability clause into documents Evelyn had carelessly signed months earlier when we were still living together under the pretense of being health insurance paperwork. Those documents made her personally responsible for the debts of the company in liquidation. It was a work of surgical precision. I moved my stock investments into hedge funds that don't generate immediate dividends, leaving them blind to my real liquidity. They saw a bank account draining and a company losing value due to market mismanagement, while I was accumulating real capital inside an impenetrable legal fortress. I remember one afternoon when I drove past the house. I saw Margaret in the garden, giving orders to a gardener with a disgusting sense of superiority. She saw me and gave me a look of pity, as if I were a beggar returning to see a lost paradise. She has no idea, I thought, that that garden no longer belongs to her or her daughter, that the bank has already begun the notification process for missed payments, that the party is about to end, and that the bill will be impossible to pay. Rational revenge isn't about shouting or violence. It's about letting your enemy walk straight to the edge of the cliff while believing they're climbing toward a throne. The day of the final hearing arrived with a radiant sun that contrasted sharply with the storm about to break inside that courtroom. Evelyn walked in as if she owned the building, wearing a designer suit she probably paid for with my credit card last month. Beside her, Margaret wore a smile of absolute satisfaction, holding her luxury handbag like a war trophy. They sat across from me, and Evelyn didn't even bother to speak to me. She looked at me over her shoulder, with the kind of contempt reserved for something already discarded. Her lawyer began with an arrogant presentation. He demanded half of the logistics company's valuation, full ownership of the mansion, and a monthly settlement that would have left any man in ruin. Evelyn nodded confidently, and Margaret, from the front row, winked at me with a malice that turned my stomach. They believed they had the world at their feet. "Your Honor," Marcus said, standing up with a calmness that chilled the room, "my client has no objection to dividing the assets Mrs. Evelyn is requesting. In fact, we are willing to grant her 100% of the logistics company and full ownership of the residential property." Evelyn's lawyer smiled, and she let out a breath of triumph, squeezing her mother's hand. But Marcus wasn't finished. He opened a black folder and placed 3 documents on the stand. "However," Marcus continued, "we must inform the court that the logistics company is currently undergoing a technical bankruptcy process due to accumulated debts with international suppliers and the expiration of working capital loans that Mrs. Evelyn signed as a joint guarantor 6 months ago. The total debt amounts to $4 million. By accepting the company, she accepts full legal responsibility for that liability." Evelyn's face went from triumph to ghostly pale in seconds. Her lawyer began flipping through the documents frantically, sweating as he read the liability clauses I had prepared months earlier. "As for the mansion," Marcus added, lowering his voice so every word carried weight, "the property has a primary mortgage that has not been paid for the last 90 days. The bank has already initiated foreclosure proceedings. If Mrs. Evelyn wishes to keep the house, she must immediately cover a payment of $1.5 million to avoid eviction, which is scheduled for next Friday at 8 in the morning." The silence in the room was so thick you could hear Margaret's broken breathing. She stood up, forgetting protocol, her eyes wide with panic. "That's a lie!" Margaret shouted, her voice trembling. "Arthur has millions. He owns everything." "He did, ma'am," I said, speaking for the first time in the entire hearing, keeping my tone as cold and flat as possible. "But as you both made very clear, I'm no longer welcome in that house or that company. I liquidated my personal share to settle my private debts. What's left is exactly what you wanted. My name on the debt documents that you now lead." Evelyn looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw real fear in her eyes. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't regret. It was the terror of a parasite realizing the host is gone and there's nothing left to feed on. She tried to speak, stammered my name, but I simply looked away. "Oh, and one more thing," Marcus added before closing his briefcase. "Since Mrs. Evelyn has no provable income and now holds debts that far exceed her assets, my client requests that any alimony claim be dismissed, as he himself declares a situation of personal financial restructuring, currently living on a minimal salary as a consultant for a new foreign firm." I walked out of the courtroom while Evelyn's lawyer shouted objections and Margaret seemed on the verge of a breakdown in the hallway. I paused briefly in front of them. Margaret grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my jacket, begging me to be reasonable. Evelyn was crying, but not for me, only for the marble she would never have and the cards that would no longer go through. "You told me to leave that night with one suitcase," I said, pulling my arm away with a sharp motion. I listened. I took the only thing that truly mattered, my ability to build from nothing. You kept what you wanted, my leftovers and my debts, Enjoy the house while you still have the keys." I walked toward the exit without looking back, hearing the echo of their desperate screams bouncing off the marble walls of the courthouse. Justice isn't always a hammer that strikes. Sometimes it's simply letting greedy people drown in the void they dug for themselves. 3 months passed since that hearing. I found out through third parties that the eviction of the mansion became neighborhood news. Evelyn and Margaret had to leave with nothing but the clothes on their backs, escorted by the police while moving trucks took away the furniture that hadn't yet been seized. They say Margaret tried to hide some jewelry in her coat, but ended up humiliated in front of the very neighbors she once tried to impress. Now they live in a small apartment, in a part of the city they used to despise, dealing with creditors who won't forgive a single cent. Evelyn called me several times, trying to use that soft voice she used to have when she wanted something, asking for mercy for old times' sake. I didn't answer. I blocked her number and every attempt she made to reach me. There's nothing to discuss with someone who was willing to see me out on the street while celebrating my supposed downfall with wine. I have started over. My new logistics company operates from a modest office but with an efficiency I never had before. I don't need a mansion or excessive luxury to feel like a successful man. I wake up every morning with the peace of someone who owes nothing to anyone. And above all, someone who knows his surroundings are real. I learned that money can buy company, but it also attracts the fiercest predators, sometimes even inside your own bed. Many people ask me if I feel bad for leaving them in ruin. The answer is a firm no. I didn't put them there. Their own hands dug that hole when they decided loyalty was negotiable and my effort was nothing more than spoils. My only action was to stop carrying the weight of their ambitions and allow reality to do its job. There's a deep kind of peace in the silence of a home where there are no whispers of betrayal. I've regained my time, my energy, and most importantly, my self-respect. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching life collect its debts. It's sitting back and observing how those who tried to destroy you end up consumed by their own greed, realizing, far too late, that the man they called weak was the only one keeping their world from collapsing. Today I sleep peacefully, knowing that everyone has exactly what they deserve. If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, make sure to leave your like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next stories.